So, as Liviu said, I'm Heather King and I'm the co-chair of CRESTEM, the Centre for Research in Education in Science, Technology, Engineering and Mathematics. A little bit of introduction to our group. Colleagues across our group are engaged in a variety of programmes. We work collaboratively with young people and with educators. We run the STEM PGCE programmes, and in our conceptualisation of STEM, that includes geography education. We run a very innovative MA programme, which we work very closely with our practising teachers, many of whom come to us on a scholarship, a funded scholarship by Wipro. And we also co-publish with many of our students as well, and I will find the book somewhere in my bag over there that shows our publications. We're very proud of that work. We have several research projects on the go. We're involved in interrogating quantitative data sets, experimenting with methods of assessment, with analysing curriculum policy, all sorts of things. But two strands really underpin the work of CRESTEM. Firstly, and as you might expect, being STEM educators, we are committed to inquiry, we're committed to the practices of practical work in the field and in the lab, and we're also involved very much so in evidence-based argumentation. But perhaps more uniquely or more notably, our work is also characterised by a commitment to social and environmental justice. So that is, we are absolutely committed to equitable engagement of young people in STEM. We research and we advise on inclusive teaching practices, and we research and consult on how all forms of education can bring in more sort of work towards understanding environmental education, understanding the climate crisis. That's a real key part of our work. Now, normally when you think of STEM, you might think about the kind of typical discourses. STEM sort of underpins economic prosperity. Many would think that STEM education is about trying to get young people to get the STEM skills they need to lead productive economic lives. In CRESTEM, we try to do things a little differently. We aim to equip our students with an understanding of STEM knowledge and practices that recognise and challenge the social and ecological injustices that development may fuel. We wish to better understand the interdependent relations between human and more than human communities. So with the Earth teetering on the edge of 1.5 degrees increase in average global temperatures, with evidence of widespread extinctions and with new incidences of trouble and unrest around the globe almost daily, it's clear that we need a transformative education. We need a new approach. Stein notes that as educators, we need to have humility and stamina to be able to cope with the multi-layered and messy transformation that's going to be required as we move towards what is essentially an unknown future. Educators will need to surrender their certainty and their security. It's not going to be easy. Now, colleagues across the school are already engaging with transformative education, both in our own higher education practices and in the work that we do with the various communities that we serve. And it's to this end that we are absolutely delighted that Professor Emily Shuckburgh is with us here today to share her experiences of supporting transformative education and the threats posed by climate change. Now, Emily is originally a mathematician by training, first at Oxford and then her PhD at Cambridge, with some stints in Paris and at MIT, before joining the British Antarctic Survey in 2006 to lead what I think is one of the best acronyms of a project going. It's called the Orchestra Project, and you're not going to work out what the acronym stands for. It's Ocean Regulation of Climate by Heat and Carbon Sequestration and Transports. Okay, so more simply, or a little bit more simply perhaps, This project involves applying the principles of fluid dynamics and lots of data modelling to understand the changes in oceanic and atmospheric processes and their impacts on climate. Now, in this role, I think we can agree that Emily was at the edge of cutting edge of scientific research into climate change, and perhaps even helped to coin the new job description of an environmental data scientist. Today, Emily is Professor of Environmental Data Science and also Director of Cambridge Zero, the University of Cambridge's climate change initiative, which aims to help identify and catalyse and to support projects all across the university on climate-related research. But not only that, she is also the Academic Director of the Institute of Computing for Climate Science and the co-director of the Centre for Landscape Regeneration. But Emily's stamina doesn't end there. Outside the academy, she holds multiple roles, enabling her to apply knowledge and to educators and educating policymakers and organisational leaders. So this work includes being the honorary president of the Aldersgate Group, which is a politically impartial multi-stakeholder alliance making the case for environmental and climate action. She's also a trustee of the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, an independent research institute dedicated to understanding how we work and how our actions can transform our interactions with the natural world. Not only that, she also writes for general public audiences in the press, and amazingly, she has also co-authored a Ladybird book with none other than King Charles. So, I mean, beat that. I think that's pretty impressive. So, as a mathematician, computer scientist, and climate specialist, Emily is clearly versed in all things STEM. Now, as a scientist, Emily will know that an object, once it starts moving,
an object remains at rest, travels at a constant speed.
Exactly.
By an external force.
Thank you, physics colleague. Okay. But as an environmentalist, Emily, and I'm sure many in this room, knows that in the case of climate change, we don't have time to wait for an external force to act upon us. We've got to do this ourselves. We have to be the impetus for change here. We need to work collectively to actually instigate the change that's needed to really try and address the climate crisis. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Emily. I'm absolutely delighted that she is here to give the annual lecture for the School of Education, Communication and Society and to share her thinking about the changes that are needed. So Emily, over to you.
Gosh, that was my whole life history as a given just then. Right, so pleasure to speak to you today. I think I'm going to, given it's hot and we've already been outside for a fire alarm, I think I'm going to talk for about half an hour and then see if we can have plenty of time for discussion. My intention really is to tell you about some of the activities that I've been involved in recently at the intersection between education and our response to not just climate change but broader ecological crisis and equally importantly the challenges of ever-increasing social inequalities. The very long title of this presentation, the second half of it, Education Visions Thriving Sustainably on Planet Earth, is the title of a book, an edited volume, that should be coming out later this year, published by Cambridge University Press, which I co-edited with two colleagues from Cambridge, James Biddulph, who until recently was the head teacher of the University of Cambridge Primary School, and Harry Pearce, who was a researcher working on democracy in the university. So some of the things that I'm going to tell you about are came about through us co-editing that volume. But I thought I would start off as a climate scientist just with an update of where the planet is at the moment in terms of climate change and broader ecological challenges. So on this exceptionally hot day, I don't think I need to remind anybody of the fact that we're now seeing ever increasing incidents of extreme weather, literally in all parts of the world. This slide just shows a few of the examples that literally over the last 2 years we've seen, from California to Nigeria to Pakistan, Spain, Libya. Instances of hugely damaging and deadly flooding events, completely unprecedented in their severity, instances of extreme heat as we're experiencing right at the moment, and those devastating wildfires that we saw in California, but I've also seen in other parts of the world, Australia in particular, in recent years. And one of the aspects that colleagues of mine often say is perhaps a little known risk in this country is indeed wildfires. And I saw just at the weekend some signs on the street saying beware of wildfire risk because as anybody who's been out into the countryside will have seen in the last few days, it's literally completely parched landscape. And so whilst we might not think of wildfires being a significant risk in this country, actually we're starting to enter into a world where it really genuinely is a risk. And the other aspect that I think is probably not as well understood is the fact that these risks all interconnect together and create potential of both systemic risks, of risks also that have the opportunity of passing irreversible tipping points in the climate system. So I've just got a few examples of those interconnected and non-linear risks that climate pose to different parts of our entire lived experience. So the first example I've got is of the disruption to supply chains, and I think somewhere in the audience here is Daoping Wang, who is a lecturer here at King's and used to be a postdoc of mine in Cambridge, who precisely works on climate risk to supply chains. So if you want to know more about that, then you can ask Daoping. But the image that's shown here is of the Panama Canal, which is critical to global supply chains and had exceptionally low water levels in it last year, partly associated with climate change related impacts, and just one example of where you can have climate impacts having major global consequences in terms of supply chains. The next example that I have on this image is another example which I think is not as widely understood as it ought to be, which is the implications of climate change for health. This photograph was taken in Paris, summer before last, and it was an arrondissement in Paris being fumigated for mosquitoes potentially carrying dengue fever. And that's an example where as temperatures have changed, particularly throughout southern Europe, we've seen the range of mosquitoes carrying dengue fever expand. And again, just one example of the potential health impacts of climate change. And then the other two examples I have on here, starting at the top, damaged infrastructure. This is an example where a succession of different climate-related impacts came together. There were extremely high temperatures in Canada a couple of years ago, reaching 50 degrees Celsius. And then there was really heavy rainfall. And on that really, really dry lands, that heavy rainfall was then devastating in terms of the infrastructure. And you can just see there the severe damage to a bridge in British Columbia. And then the final example comes from my Antarctic origins in terms of my science career, and the really great concern of us potentially passing tipping points in the climate system. You will have heard of some of those, the risk of the loss of the vast ice sheets covering West Antarctica and also Greenland in the north, and the potential really significant sea level rise that would eventually ensue as a result, that would threaten millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people living in coastal regions around the world. There are concerns about the potential tipping points in terms of the vast global overturning circulation of the ocean, or of the integrity of the Amazon rainforest, or the potential of release of vast stores of frozen methane from the Arctic. So just some of the examples of the threats to the climate system. Now, those climate-related threats are but one of a whole series of sustainability-related challenges. Challenges to our natural world. The rates of extinction of species are the highest they have been throughout all of human history, and it's estimated that at least 1 million species may be at risk of extinction over the coming decades. The rates of deforestation, which both have an impact on climate change and also on biodiversity loss, are absolutely staggering. Primary tropical forest, the size of almost half of England, was lost just last year, in a single year. And you know, it's impossible to really visualize quite that extent happening year on year on year. But those aren't the only environmental threats. And I've got just one example here in terms of air pollution, indoor and outdoor air pollution, estimated to result in 7 million premature deaths each year. And then along the bottom there, I've got other aspects of sustainability-related challenges in terms of the really significant number of people who either don't have enough water, enough food, enough clean energy in the world today, as well as that really substantial inequality that exists both between countries and within countries. And in a sense, that is the background landscape within which, as educators, whether that's educators of university level students, younger children, or adults, it feels we have a real responsibility to understand how we can respond. This is an image that came from the last IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, to try to give a sense of the very different life history of somebody born today compared to somebody who was born in 1950. So a child born today, the global average life expectancy is about 73 years. So they are likely to live to close on the end of the century. And depending on the trajectory that we take in terms of climate change, they are likely to be living in a very, very different world, the world in which we live in today. And translating that through again into thinking about the education that we ought to be providing to young people today, part of that surely is to help equip them to navigate through the challenges that are likely to be a significant part of their lives over the coming decades. So again, just to reinforce where we are in terms of the current state of the planet. In terms of climate change, the key driving force of climate change is, of course, greenhouse gas emissions. And our current concentrations of key greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, are the highest they have been in at least 800,000 years for methane and at least 2 million years for carbon dioxide. Both instances it's probably a lot longer, but that's just where we have the evidence base. And you can see here in these graphs how those levels of carbon dioxide concentrations have changed just since the 1980s to today, and essentially a steady increase year on year on year. And that is the key driver of climate change. But what I wanted to really highlight is not that those levels are going up, but the underlying inequity that is associated with those increases in atmospheric concentration. So if we look at the emissions of carbon dioxide by the wealthiest and the least wealthy in the global population, you immediately see a really, really stark difference. So the global top 1% of the population in terms of wealth is responsible for 17% of global carbon dioxide emissions, whereas the entire bottom 50% of the global population by wealth is responsible for just 12%. So 50% of the global population responsible for considerably less carbon emissions than the top 1%. And that, I think, really is quite shocking in terms of the levels of inequality. All of the scientific evidence base is brought together in the IPCC reports with a 5-year cycle. And the last IPCC report, in terms of the overall synthesis of that evidence base, had one sentence in it which certainly I felt was particularly poignant and particularly important, and it was this one, that there's a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And in a sense, everything that I'm going to say follows is very much cognizant of that and cognizant of understanding the full implications of that, both in terms of supporting citizens to develop responses to that, to develop solutions associated with that, to develop resilience to live through the consequences of that, and that resilience both in a physical sense of our environment, how can we adapt to climate change, but also mental resilience to cope with the challenges associated with that. And I focused a lot on climate because that's my background, but the natural world more broadly is also under severe threat. The most recent report from WWF's Living Planet report had this as its headline, that since the 1970s, on average, wildlife species have seen a 73% decline, and some species even more so. So we have fished out something like 90% of large fish in the world's oceans, just as one example of the really significant changes that we've seen. And of course, as I already highlighted, some million species are at threat of extinction over the coming decades. So it's not just that our world is changing, and I can see everyone fanning in the extreme heat that we're seeing at the moment in terms of our climate, but our world is also changing in terms of the nature that we share the planet with. And that has both a profound impact in terms of our own lived experience, as well as really significant implications for what it means to be human. I have two daughters who are now 10 and 12, and a couple of years ago we were collectively watching the latest David Attenborough series, and the daughter that's now 12, after a while refused to watch any more episodes. and she refused to watch any more episodes because she just found it so sad. And she ended up just going to bed and sitting in bed saying, I don't see the point in living. And I thought, oh my goodness, how do I deal with this poor child? I was a bit worried I had a mental health crisis on my hands. And I sat and spoke to her, and eventually she explained that it wasn't that she personally didn't see the point in living, but she didn't see the point in humanity if this was what we were doing to the world. Which actually I thought was quite a profound thing for, probably only a child has the imagination to say something so profound. But that relationship between us as humans and the natural world is really profound, and it is very much under threat. So how can we help young people to understand how to respond in terms of that? These are the UN Sustainability Goals. This is the last update in terms of progress with respect to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You can see that none of them are green. If they were green, then that would suggest that those goals had been achieved. But almost all of the goals have really significant gaps, and some of them are actually going backwards rather than forwards in terms of the progress. Again, part of the very challenging times in which we live. All of this is, as I'm continuing to come back to as a theme, underlying really significant inequalities and injustices. And I put this slide up, it actually was highlighted by one of my colleagues in Cambridge, Bhaskar Vera, who's a geographer who studies political economy, but particularly in a sustainability context. And he pointed me to a book that was written in 1991 by Indian colleagues of his that were highlighting the inequality and the fundamental root cause of many of the environmental crises that are driven by inequalities, and was himself pointing out the irony that much of this work, the profound original work undertaken by Indian scholars, have been largely forgotten about and reinvented later, with that narrative being somewhat adopted by others. But these inequalities are really important and essential to recognise and incorporate. So, I started off describing that the title of this talk was Education Visions Thriving Sustainably on Planet Earth, and that came from the title of a book that I had put together with James Biddulph and Harry Pearce. And that book itself is a collection of essays by academic experts working in different areas associated with sustainability, together with examples of where the concepts from those academic interventions have been taken into classrooms, particularly with younger children in their primary school age range, and implemented in a classroom context. And so it's both a series of interventions suggesting key aspects which are important to include in future education, with practical guide to where they have been implemented. And what was interesting about this series of essays is that when we brought them all together, and it is a somewhat eclectic mix of different topics, but when we brought them all together, there were a series of common threads that were clearly underlie all of them. And for any of those of you who are working in the education sector, I'm sure that these will all sound very familiar. They certainly sounded very familiar in terms of the introductory remarks that we had. And so I've got a few examples here where I picked up some of the key themes that came out through that, and then given some examples of where in Cambridge we've been trying to undertake work in support of those. So one of the key themes that really came out was around empowering active citizens, giving people, young people, the information to understand the changes that are happening that are relevant to their current and future lives, but also the skill set to be able to help develop solutions. So there's this, that they've got a degree of agency, or empowered to have a degree of agency in terms of that response. Multiple different examples of that happening. One example that we've been involved in collaboration with Cambridge University Press and Assessment, is developing this water curriculum, which is now was co-developed and co-designed with colleagues in India, and is now being rolled out to tens of thousands of students in Indian schools. But there are many other examples that we had from multiple schools across the world of, in different ways, student voices being encouraged and integrated within the democratic processes in schools to, at a really early stage, help encourage that sense of agency and the sense of developing students themselves being able to help develop solutions. Here's just one example this was a project that was undertaken in the University of Cambridge Primary School, where a combination of that sense of agency was combined together with, in a very kind of creative way, to try to help the young children understand that there were potential different futures, and they might be able to implement those different futures. And so this was an art project that the students undertook, where they were given cardboard boxes, and they were then asked to create images of different potential futures that they put on the sides of the cardboard boxes, and they were then able to turn the boxes to create different futures. And it was a simple project, but one that was both for the students' perspective and as a creative art project in itself was really quite evocative. Just one sort of example of where that combination, and this kept on coming out throughout multiple of the chapters in the book, was the combination between finding innovative ways of helping children to understand the challenges, to have agency in creating solutions, but also to combine that together in a very transdisciplinary way that might be more compelling for the children to engage with than simply showing them a set of graphs and figures as I did at the start of this presentation. That concept of creativity and the concept of how to, again, channel that through children's education was another key message that came through. And this, again, this was actually related to the Ladybird book that I wrote with the King. And this was where we took that book into schools and then used that as a stimulus material for the schools. Again, they created a series of artworks showing the images of the environment that they would like to live in, and that's where you can see happening there. But equally importantly, is the other word on this slide is not just helping to inspire creativity and consequently help children to think through creatively how they might be able to be part of solutions, but also that sense of resilience, and particularly the mental resilience associated with exactly that story that I was telling of my 12-year-old and her sense of there not being a purpose in life when this is the way that we're treating the planet. Here's another example that we've been involved in of that really transdisciplinary approach. This was an opera that was performed in Saffron Hall earlier this year that had a climate change theme. If you haven't seen it, it's called Uprising. I believe it's supposed to be playing at Glyndebourne and various other places. Associated with this, we from Cambridge Zero worked together with the, well, first of all, we worked together to help in terms of the writing of the opera in the first place, but then we worked with local schools to use this as stimulus material for discussing climate change in the classrooms. And just as a different and unusual way of bringing a topic that can be quite scientific to different audiences, then it felt as though it was really engaging. But it also, the opera itself, I don't think you could, well, you might be able to see there was a sort of central storyline that was essentially a Greta Thunberg storyline, but there were all sorts of hugely creative elements in it. Some of the people at the back there are trees that are being cut down, and so they took on their own kind of personification of the trees themselves in a really evocative way. Actually channeling quite a lot of the aspects of research that's currently being undertaken by many of my colleagues who are increasingly focused on the rights of nature and understanding how both in terms of key aspects of the natural worlds, mountains and hills and rivers and indeed entire continents like Antarctica, that it may only be by assigning them equivalent rights of a person that we can as a human species truly understand how to protect them. Another aspect that came through really clearly in the work that we've been undertaking on the education front was the importance of wider community engagement and a real sense that schools can often be an anchor point for that community engagement. And what I wanted to describe here is not so much something that came out of that book, but wider work that we've been undertaking, where we've been really focused on interaction between community engagement and the research that we actually undertake. So one of the projects that I lead that you heard about at the start is our Centre for Landscape Regeneration in Cambridge. And that research centre is focused on looking at how, initially in the UK, we might be able to manage some landscapes differently for the benefit of climate and nature, but taking into account the socio-economic context of those landscapes. And there are 3 landscapes that we're working in at the moment. We're working just outside of Cambridge in the East Anglian Fens, which is a very agriculturally intensive part of the country, but it's mostly crops grown on peatland that was drained in the 17th century, and there are some really significant carbon emissions when you intensively farm peatland, and there's also really significant biodiversity impacts as well. But that region has really important, first of all, really significant socio-economic inequalities throughout the region, but also agriculture is absolutely central to the economy of the region. So there's lots of challenges in terms of how you understand how you might be able to manage the land into the future in a way that's not having such a big environmental impact, but also is acting to improve the socio-economic outcomes for people who live in that region. The other two regions that we're working in are the Lake District in Cumbria and the Cairngorms in Scotland, and they both have their own set of environmental and social challenges in those landscapes, but they're different to the fens. What we've been undertaking first of all in the Fenland landscape is really deep community engagement with many, many different communities within the landscape. First of all, as part of an engagement activity, and informative activity, but more importantly, to help shape the research as well. And some of that has been undertaken with school children, and some of that has been undertaken with other different stakeholders in the landscape. So this is just some examples of that happening. So we worked with the Cambridge Science Centre, which has a base in Wisbech, which is one of the most economically deprived cities in the Fens. And we had an activity that now over 1,000 school children have participated in, where they got to take on the role of different groups within the Fenland landscape. So you can see one of the children here is assigned the role of a farmer. There were other children who were assigned roles of wildlife reserve manager or of one of the local business managers, or etc. So they all took on different roles and then had to essentially role play, envisaging what they would like to see from the landscape into the future. And we use the results of that to feed back into our research itself. And we combined it together with a similar scenario planning exercise that we undertook with people who were actually farmers in the landscape, or were had other roles in the landscape. And collectively that has informed our research in a really, really productive way. And many of the most innovative ideas that we've had as to how we might be able to manage the land differently into the future have come out of those exercises. And similarly, we've been working with our other assets that we have in the university, including our museums, to understand in that very two-way process how we can engage with a broader set of publics in terms of our activities. And there was a nice quote here that we had after one of the activities that we did with local schools in the museum, around the access and the benefit of the access to the museum that they'd had as a result of being able to take part of the work that we were doing that really connected with the children and bring them into the museum in that context. So I've tried to give you just a few little examples from some of the work that we've been undertaking of the ways in which we've been trying to take concepts that we've gathered together in a somewhat ad hoc manner, and then actually implement some of them through different activities that we've been undertaking, particularly with young people. More broadly, both here in King's College as well as in Cambridge University, we've started to try and understand how we can develop a whole institution response to sustainability, which spans both the research that we undertake in both institutions, the education we undertake in both institutions, the operations of the buildings and the estate, and all our interactions with policy and innovation and industry, and the wider public. And I think I can say that both institutions are really committed to trying to see how ambitious they can be and a real sense of duty and responsibility in terms of responding to that. And so I think I'd like to end just by saying that that ambition is a collective effort, and so if people here want to become involved and support, I know that Brands, who's one of the people who helps lead that, and Rachel, I'm sure would be delighted to have you help them do that. And the more that we can connect together as different institutions and understand how collectively we can address these challenges, then we might have a hope of addressing some of the very profound implications that I showed at the start of this era that is often known as the Anthropocene. Thank you.
So, questions from the floor? I'll start. Lovely. Thank you, Rachel.
Oh, sorry. That was wonderful. That's wonderful. And I love all those pictures of those young people. We probably think more about the slightly older group, the ones that are coming into our university. So can I ask you something about that? Because presumably you also work with that older group. And I'm particularly interested in, I went to a conference this morning where they told me that the content of the A-level curriculum has been stripped back so much to really core, especially biology. It's been stripped back to biomedical science. There is no ecology left in the A-level biology curriculum. And this is leading to a downturn in people being interested in STEM and environmental issues. And I just wondered whether that was something you'd thought about in Cambridge, or anyone perhaps in ECS had thought about in terms of how do we influence the A-level curriculum? Does the content actually control what happens to people? I imagine it does. I'm not an expert. And what are your views about the content of the curriculum?
Yeah, so maybe I can talk about the A-level and then actually the content we teach our own students in the university. So most of the work that we have been doing has been through Cambridge University Press and Assessment, just because they're our closest colleagues. There is a new GCSE in natural history, which I know they're quite excited about. And we have been working quite closely with them, actually subject by subject, in terms of helping to support curricular reform, particularly at A-level. So I know the subjects that we've currently worked on have been business studies and geography. And we do these things called convocations. I didn't know this was a word, but apparently it is, and it exists in terms of the activities that they do. So we've been bringing academic researchers from the geography department or from the business school together to help inform the curricular review. So I think that's been a very positive process where we've been very, very actively involved in helping to support that. And we obviously would like to do that in other subjects as well over time, but now we've built up that relationship, that feels very possible. And because Cambridge University Press and Assessment don't just act in this country, but they have a global presence in terms of the school curricula, it feels as though we have quite a significant global impact in that regard. And then with regard to our own students, we have been systematically, again, going through subject by subject, helping to support curricular reform. So in some subjects that's really substantive. So chemical engineering, for example, has, really is undergoing a big transformation in terms of what they teach the students, but it's much more extensive than just that. So clinical medicine is another area that's really taking, I mentioned some of the health impacts of climate change, but they're really taking climate change and sustainability very seriously as part of their curricular reform. And even the English department has started to introduce CLI-FI, which apparently is a thing. Climate literature is called CLI-FI, as part of the material. So literally, and so what we initially did was we took one topic per school of the university, to work with, and in different ways. And we've done that very much collaboratively with the students, so that much of the project has been led by the Student Climate Society, and we've been taking a kind of supportive role in association with that. So yeah, we've been acting at all stages. And the other area of education that I didn't mention at all, but where we're very, very active, is in terms of adult and particularly executive education, where we do a lot on sustainability. And again, across a really wide range of different areas. So one area that I think is probably one of the most impactful, when, as a university, we agreed to divest of fossil fuels from our endowment, we actually went slightly further than that, and we said that we would have an ambition of having a net zero investment portfolio by 2038. And because our endowment is invested in funds rather than directly invested, then the only way of achieving that is by influencing the fund managers. So we actually have put on a education sustainability course for all the fund managers. And again, the kind of scale of influence of that is potentially really large. So they've had, I think it's coming up to $500 billion of assets under management of all the fund managers that have been through our course now, which starts to be, well, the university's endowment is about 4 billion, so when you scale that up to nearly $500 billion, then you start to have really quite big influence.
Are there other questions we could bring together? No? Go for it, John.
Hi, I'm John Owens. I'm a lecturer here in the school. Thank you very much for the talk, Emily. It was fascinating. So I'm interested in taking up the theme of transformative environmental education, and here we are obviously in higher education. The way that you've contextualized what you said today makes it feel really clear that the climate crisis is inherently political in its causes and its consequences, the way it plays out. But I suppose many of us would recognize that the way that environmental education is typically delivered is apolitical. It doesn't, or at least politically impartial, we should say. So it tends to focus on the facts, teaching the facts, without going into some of the more political dimensions of the crisis. So I'm wondering, particularly in the context of higher education, where we have a lot of autonomy to teach as we would like to, and we have, I guess, ambitions, and we have the potential to do quite a lot, as well as perhaps the responsibility to deliver more transformative forms of environmental education, where education is amongst our core business, right? We produce research, we produce knowledge, but we reproduce it as well. So my question, sorry about the long preamble, to what extent should environmental education within higher education be explicitly engaging with the political dimensions of the climate crisis? And to what extent should it kind of be unafraid to sort of embrace a more critical and transformative approach rather than reproducing sort of the status quo as it was?
So I think that the two projects that I'm most focused on describing here, the book that I'd written with the primary education focus and that Centre for Landscape Regeneration project, in both instances, they are genuinely transdisciplinary kind of approaches. I think that, especially on the Centre for Landscape Regeneration, which is a research council, Natural Environment Research Council funded project, I think even a few years ago, it would have been quite difficult to do something that was quite so transdisciplinary. But I think it's quite clear that to really be able to address any of these challenges, which are fundamentally, inherently political, as you describe, then you really have to take that transdisciplinary approach. And given the kind of siloed nature that especially between the kind of two cultures of science versus non-science, then it's being quite radical to do something that is that engaged. And so in that instance, I think it was it's been a bit of a challenge, actually, even getting it to work, although I think we're now starting to get there. On the education side of things, I think it was a bit more naturalist, maybe especially because we were focusing on younger children, where maybe these artificial distinctions between, scientific way of thinking versus non-scientific way of thinking are maybe not as ingrained as they are as you go higher up the education system. I think it wasn't as difficult to be automatically thinking in a more transdisciplinary way. But certainly from my perspective, I think I've rapidly come to the conclusion that that's the only way of us really approaching these challenges, and therefore, what are the implications of that? It probably has quite profound implications for how we structure our education at all levels, doesn't it? And how we challenge, even further than the steps that we've taken already to try and break down those disciplinary barriers that exist particularly in higher education institutions.
Well, thank you, Professor. I'm the PhD student in King's College London, Department of Geography. So since you are already digging into climate change and also AI area for years, I have a question that is, well, given AI's growing influence on both climate science and education, what do you see as the most promising synergies between these fields in the coming decades? Since a lot of universities and schools, they are developing AI-driven platform. So do you think it is possible, we combine these two tools to accelerating climate literacy and behavioral change?
Yeah, I didn't talk about the research that I do associated with AI, but there's a lot of research that I'm involved in associated with AI and how we can be utilising that in a beneficial way to help across all the different challenges that I was talking about today. So we've got lots of that Centre for Landscape Regeneration project that I described. There's lots of different ways in which we're using AI to integrate data sets that we have associated with either the conservation aspects of the and biodiversity loss aspects of the work that we're doing, or the climate modelling aspects of the work that we're doing. So there's lots of beneficial ways in which AI can be utilised, but it comes back to exactly what we were just talking about. There's all sorts of other consequences that are ethical considerations, or the environmental impact of AI itself in terms of the energy usage, the real potential for AI to exacerbate underlying inequalities, whether that's how AI has been trained, or the questions that AI is addressing, or the access to the information that comes out of the AI systems. One of the elements that we have been stressing a lot, and I've been working with other researchers in Cambridge focusing on that ethical dimension, is the absolute centrality of including human-in-the-loop components in an AI system to try and address some of those otherwise ethical issues. So AI, I think, is clear that it is going to be transformative in terms of both solutions we develop to many of our challenges, and also to the education, the method of educating itself, but understanding that in this wider context that I've just been describing, and the interactions of AI with this wider system that I've been describing, is clearly essential as well. Otherwise, it's actually only going to be exacerbating the underlying threats that we've already got.
I'm thinking that it might be a good idea to move towards the refreshments to continue our conversation. Lots of people are looking very hot, which is, a sign of lots of thinking below the temperature. I'm sure we've all been super engaged in Emily's presentation today. So it just leaves me with a few thank yous. I'd like to thank Gurpreet for organising organising lots of the steps for this, so thank you very much. Thank you all very much for coming and joining us today, but most of all I'd like to thank Professor Emily Shuckburgh for an amazing presentation. I really hope that we are going to have more collaborations with Emily and the team at Cambridge. I think a lot of what they're doing there and what we're doing here at King's, both across the college and within our particular school, there's so many alignments, so I'm really excited if we can work more closely, that would be super. So a big round of applause for Emily.